oferecemos o que há de mais moderno em sistemas de visão, leitores de códigos de barras e checker, produtos de alta performance da Cogniz. Saiba mais no nosso site.
Automotive Business recebe a visita de Stefan Kise, que é sócio da Roland Berger. Ele é um especialista global em questões ligadas ao setor automotivo e ele acompanha há bastante tempo tudo o que acontece aqui no Brasil. Nós vamos fazer entrevista em inglês para que ele possa se expressar com mais facilidade a respeito de questões que envolvem competitividade e o crescimento do mercado brasileiro. So, Stefan, welcome to Automotive Business.
Thank you very much.
We would like to understand what's happening in the automotive market here in Brazil, because we sell a lot of cars in this moment, but there is a strong concern about the lack of competitiveness in the market. What do you think about that?
That's very true, Paulo. On the one side, we have a tremendous growth in the Brazilian market. We have reached today with more than 3.6 million cars probably being sold in Brazil this year, a level where most people only a few years ago would not have thought that this is feasible. And the general perspective is also that this growth will continue for the next years. We expect at least 5 million cars being sold 2015, 2016, 4 or 5 years today, being driven by a very strong Brazilian economy, being driven by a very strong demand from the consumer with increasing income and growth, especially in newly developing regions inside Brazil, like the Northeast or the center of Brazil.
And what will be the profile of that new car that we expect in Brazil? The content of the car?
I think the market is changing in the last years. Only 5-6 years ago in Brazil, mostly models sold that had been already produced many years before in Europe, in Japan, or in the US. Today, the Brazilian consumer wants a modern car with a modern design, with high level of technology, safety, or features, and something that is much more in line with the global cars and the global platforms than before. At the same time, we see above average growth in the premium segment with premium brands, especially from Europe. And we see a lot of growth in the entry-level segment with Chinese car makers coming into Brazil and offering attractive cars at a very, very low price for the Brazilian consumer. But all this growth in our perspective is driven from the interior of Brazil. The export of Brazil is decreasing, and more cars in the future are being imported from Mexico, from Europe, or from Asia to satisfy the demand here in Brazil. And this import is facilitated by the problematic positioning of the Brazilian automotive industry in terms of competitiveness, in terms of cost, and also with a lack of local access to technology and to innovation. Just to give one example, in the area of airbag, it is still today very difficult for most OEMs to buy the airbag within Brazil, even so it will be mandatory in just a few years, because so far there's not enough capacity to produce this product. And for all the different new technologies that have been developed around the world in the automotive industry, electric cars, driver assistance systems, more comfort features, we see a very similar picture here in Brazil. I also mentioned the very high cost here in Brazil. We have a high level of production cost, driven by various factors, driven by high material cost, also driven by bureaucracy in Brazil, by a high level of taxation of the companies, as well as overall of a lack of automation and efficiency improvement of the Brazilian companies or of the international companies here in Brazil. So with that situation, it has become very difficult in Brazil to produce a car at a cost that is comparable to Mexico or to China or to Korea. And that, of course, will spur and will drive for the future a lot of international importation.
So in that point of view, we will produce global platforms, but we will not be able to export those cars produced in Brazil?
That is true. The Brazilian market for the next years is entirely driven by the internal demand. It is changing to global platforms, but it is not part really of the global production network that the OEMs have. Because if you look even at close markets, Chile, Peru, Colombia, it is often cheaper and more profitable for a global OEM to produce the platform in Europe, in the US, in Mexico, or even in China and export there than to produce here in Brazil and export to these markets.
And auto parts, what about? Brazil will develop new technologies. What are we doing in engineering?
I see, in general, unfortunately, too little investment into real engineering here in Brazil. There's a lot of application engineering, but there's little research and little innovation and little new patents that are also attractive to the global industry outside Brazil. As you know, there is a big shortage of engineers in Brazil. There are only about 50,000 engineers leaving university every year, which is a very, very small number when you compare it to the US, to Europe, to China, which produce much more engineers and can therefore much easier support the companies in their innovation efforts.
And in the field of auto parts, what are the opportunities here in Brazil?
Again, I see the opportunities primarily driven from the internal market. Last year, the Brazilian auto parts industry was working at 95% capacity utilization, which is not only at capacity, it's actually over normal capacity. So they are investing very heavily in creating new capacity here in Brazil. With these investments, fortunately, there's also an increase in automation and an increase in production efficiency to supply the demand and follow the investments that all the OEMs from all around the world are currently making in Brazil. But with the current exchange rate and the current production cost inside Brazil, I think it will be very hard for a Brazilian automotive supplier to have a long-term strategy to export from Brazil to any other automotive producing countries, with maybe the exception of Argentina, simply because of Mercosur, simply because of logistical proximity.
So thinking about now distribution, car distribution in Brazil, there is a war in the market. How do you see that?
It's right. Despite the very positive growth that we have in the market right now, there is a war going on, a war for market share. There are several brands in Brazil which are competing to have a very good development of their market share, to maintain their market share, defend it against the growth that comes from against the new market entrants that come from Asia, from China, from Korea. And this war for market share is to a good extent also done by pricing. And of course, as soon as you start a price war, this has an impact on the margins and on the profitability of the entire value chain, starting from the dealer to the OEM and eventually also coming down to the supplier.
So in the distribution, there is a war against brands and against dealers, different dealers.
It's a war between the different brands, and because of the incentive systems of the OEMs, it's also a fight between dealers of the same brand to have the best market share that they can and increase the volumes even when they're not making sufficient profitability. We have at the moment a very high share in Brazil of direct sales, especially to large fleets, which depress at the end the used car prices, because a lot of these fleets resell the cars after a relatively short time. And then, of course, the semi-novos directly compete with the stock that the dealers have on their ground.
So you are supposed to be at the next seminar, SAE seminar, Trends in the Automotive Industry. What do you expect to present there?
I think we will present a summary of what we are discussing here to show the challenges of the market. On the one side, the very positive development, and on the other side, the positive development in line with market growth, in line with new platforms, with new technologies coming to Brazil. And on the other side, the challenge to incorporate this growth and incorporate these new platforms into the local value chain at the Brazilian cost level. We will show and discuss some of the levers that can be done and that are needed to reduce the cost and increase the overall competitiveness of the Brazilian automotive industry in a global environment.
Bem, Stefan, muito obrigado pela visita ao Automotive Business. Nós vamos nos encontrar no próximo simpósio da SAE, que é organizado por Automotive Business, e lá nós vamos ter a oportunidade de conversar um pouco mais sobre tudo isso e responder também as perguntas dos participantes do nosso evento. Muito obrigado.
Keine Ursache.